The monitoring station at the edge of the Vreth corridor was not a place where exciting things happened. Commander Dale Harmon had been there for almost 2 years, and in that time the most dramatic event had been a coolant leak in the lower deck that smelled terrible for 3 weeks. The station was small, quiet, and far from everything. That was exactly how Dale had started to like it. He was a tall man with tired eyes and a habit of drinking his coffee before it cooled. He had spent 20 years in deep space service, survived 2 dangerous tours near the outer belt colonies, and had asked for this quiet posting himself. His crew was small. Lieutenant Nina Voss ran signals and communications from a cluttered workstation covered in handwritten notes. Chief Engineer Lou Carver kept the station alive through a combination of mechanical skill and stubborn refusal to let anything break permanently. On a night that started like every other night, Nina sat down at her console, ran her usual scan sweep, and stopped moving. She stared at the data on her screen for a long moment. Then she called Dale over without saying why, which was unusual for her because Nina always had something to say. He looked at the screen. The signal was not from any human source. The frequency pattern was complex in a way that natural radio emissions simply were not. It repeated at irregular intervals, which ruled out machine error. There was structure in it, layered structure, the kind that took intelligence to create. And buried inside that structure, clear enough once Nina pointed it out, was a pattern that matched universal distress encoding, the kind of signal that meant someone, somewhere, was asking for help. Lou leaned in from behind them both. He looked at the data, said nothing for a moment, and then said that he was going to make more coffee because this was going to be a long night. Nina traced the signal back to its origin point. The coordinates put the source deep inside the Vreth corridor, in a region that even experienced pilots avoided because of unstable gravitational pockets and 3 different kinds of radiation that played badly with standard shielding. Whatever had sent this signal had sent it from a place where no human ship had business going. Dale sent the full transmission to Earth Command with a priority flag and a short note. He did not try to decode the alien signal himself. That was above his clearance and above his expertise. What he did do was stay awake for the next 18 hours watching the signal repeat, making sure it was not a natural phenomenon, making sure it was not going to stop. It did not stop. At Earth Command, the transmission reached Admiral Grace Donovan at an hour when most of the building was quiet. She read Dale's note, reviewed the signal analysis from her technical team, and then pulled up the alien frequency database. The match took 4 seconds. The signal belonged to the Selhari. Grace had dealt with the Selhari before, not in person but through diplomatic channels and medical exchange programs. They were not a warrior species. They did not build weapons or train soldiers. They were scientists, healers, architects of living systems. 15 years ago, during the Proxima Plague, Selhari biotechnology had provided the key component of the treatment that saved 40 million human lives. They had shared it freely, without conditions, because that was simply how they operated. Now they were calling for help. Grace convened an emergency session the next morning. A few voices in the room argued for caution, for sending a scout ship first, for waiting to understand the full situation before committing resources. Grace listened to all of them. Then she reminded the room, quietly and without drama, what the Selhari had done during the plague. She said that humanity did not get to receive that kind of help, and then looked the other way when the people who gave it were in trouble. The vote was not close. Humanity would answer. Dale received the response from Earth Command 6 hours later. He read it twice, then walked to the observation window and looked out at the dark stretch of space in the direction of the Vreth corridor. Somewhere out there, something terrible was happening to people who had never once chosen to hurt anyone. He went and told Nina, and Lulu asked how bad it was. Dale said they did not know yet. Nina said that the signal had changed slightly in the last few hours, that the distress pattern was becoming more compressed, more urgent. Whatever was happening was getting worse. Lou refilled his coffee and said that somebody needed to go fix it then. He said it the same way he talked about the coolant leak. Like it was just a problem waiting for the right people to show up. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet was not the largest fleet Earth Command had, but it was the one with the fastest response time and the most experience operating in environments that had no business being survivable. Captain Ray Holt had commanded it for 3 years, and in that time he had taken it through 4 hostile contact situations and brought every crew member home. He was known for being calm under fire to a degree that some people found unsettling, and for being almost impossible to beat at poker, which he was actually quite bad at, but which he won consistently by never showing anything on his face. Ray got the mission briefing on a Tuesday morning. He read through it once, asked 3 questions about the Drath Collective that nobody could fully answer yet, and then told his staff to begin fleet preparation. There was no long speech. Ray was not a long speech kind of person. His ground commander was Major Dana Pruitt, a Marine who had spent 12 years fighting in environments that required full environmental suits just to step outside. She had operated on moons with toxic atmospheres, on stations with failing life support, and on one memorable occasion in the pressurized interior of a captured enemy vessel while it was actively venting atmosphere into space. She was not large in the way that some soldiers were large, but she moved like someone who had absolute confidence in her own body, like every step was exactly the step she meant to take. Her platoon sergeant was a man named Gus Mercer. Gus was quiet in the specific way that very experienced soldiers are quiet, meaning that he did not waste words, but the words he used tended to be exactly right. He kept a worn paperback novel in his breast pocket. No one on the team had ever seen him actually read it. The fleet also carried Dr. Lena Farrow, a xenobiologist with 17 years of fieldwork studying alien biology. She had a habit of narrating what she was observing out loud even when no one was listening, which annoyed people at first and then became background noise that everyone quietly relied on. She was the best at reading alien physiology of anyone in the fleet, possibly anyone in the service. Kevin Sharp was 24 years old and on his first real deep space deployment. He was the communications officer, and his gift for alien languages was the kind of gift that made language specialists twice his age quietly frustrated. He had been studying Selhari dialect patterns for 2 days straight since the mission briefing and had already identified 3 regional variations in the distress signal. He also still flinched at loud noises and had not yet learned to sleep through hull vibrations. The fleet made its exit from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vreth corridor and immediately ran a full tactical scan. The picture that came back was not good. 3 Selhari colony worlds showed no power signatures, no communication traffic, no heat signatures from population centers. Dark in the specific way that meant they were not just quiet but gone. The 4th world was still transmitting, but the transmissions were fragmented and increasingly desperate, and the thermal imaging showed large sections of the surface burning. Kevin pulled the intercepted communications from the attacking force and spent 40 minutes working through the language structure before he could give Ray anything useful. What he found was that the attackers were called the Drath Collective, a hive mind species that had been expanding through this region of space for at least 60 years by the most conservative estimate. They did not negotiate. They did not occupy. They consumed resources, populations, everything of use, and moved on. The Selhari had encountered them the way a field encounters fire. The Drath fleet outnumbered the 7th by a factor of 6. Their individual ships were larger on average. Their weapon systems were well documented from earlier encounters with other species, and the documentation was not encouraging. Ray called a briefing. He laid out the numbers without softening them. He let everyone sit with the picture for a moment. Then Dana spoke. She had been looking at the tactical data the whole time, arms crossed, head slightly tilted the way she looked when she was thinking through a problem from multiple angles at once. She said that the numbers were the kind of numbers humans had beaten before. Not easily, and not without cost, but before. She said that what the Drath had in size and volume they probably did not have in adaptability, because hive mind species tended to be excellent at executing plans and poor at responding to things that did not fit their existing models. She said that the 7th was very good at not fitting existing models. Ray looked at her for a moment and then nodded once. He said they would make contact with the Selhari survivors first, get full intelligence on the Drath formation, and then build a plan. He said it the way he said most things, like the outcome was already settled and the only remaining task was the work. Kevin, at his station, was already compiling everything he had on the Selhari distress signal, trying to find a frequency they could use to make contact without alerting the Drath. He found one in about 20 minutes. He looked surprised at himself, and then quickly looked like he had not looked surprised, because he was trying very hard to seem like someone who belonged on a mission like this. Gus watched the young officer from across the room and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly in a way that people who knew him well would have recognized. The Vale Soren was a generation ship, which meant it had been built to carry people across very long distances over very long times. It was enormous by any standard, a slow-moving city in space, and right now it was running with most of its systems at minimum power in an attempt to avoid drawing attention from the draft fleet that was still sweeping the region. Inside its cryogenic holds, nearly 900,000 Selhari were suspended in cold sleep, waiting for a destination they were not yet sure existed. The ship's elder, Urath, had been awake for 6 days straight. He was the one who had sent the distress signal. He had done it because there was nothing else left to do, not because he believed it would work. The Selhari had contacted dozens of species over their history. Most of them were careful, cautious civilizations that weighed risks carefully before acting. None of them were close enough to help in time. And none of them were humans. When Kevin's signal reached the Vale Soren on a tight beam frequency that the draft scanners were not tuned for, Urath almost did not respond. He thought it might be a draft trick. He sat with his communication officers for a long time, analyzing the transmission structure, before he concluded that no draft communication had ever been built with this particular kind of layered redundancy. This was something that had been put together in a hurry by someone who was very good at languages and very worried about being overheard. He opened the channel. Kevin's voice, speaking broken but functional Selhari, came through the ship's speakers. Urath's communication officers looked at each other. None of them had expected to hear their language from wherever the signal was coming from. Kevin identified the ship, identified Ray by name and rank, and said simply that they had received the distress call and had come. Urath asked who they were. Kevin said they were human. There was a long pause on the Selhari side of the channel. The Selhari knew of humans. Most spacefaring species did, in the way that you know about a weather pattern or a geological feature, something real and notable but distant from your own experience. Humans were the ones from the high-gravity world, the one with the thick atmosphere and the violent weather and the biological ecosystem that treated everything as either predator or prey. Humans were the ones who had not just survived that world but had come out of it apparently delighted, as if the whole experience had been some kind of training exercise. Other species found this difficult to understand. Urath had certainly not expected them to show up here. Ray came to the communication channel himself and spoke through Kevin's translation. He kept it simple. He said the 7th Fleet was positioned between the Vale Soren and the main Drath formation. He said they would need full intelligence on the Drath ship positions and any tactical information the Selhari had gathered. He said that his people were going to get the Vale Soren out of the corridor. Urath asked how. He was not being difficult. He genuinely wanted to understand, because the mathematics of the situation, 6-to-1 odds with larger ships, did not produce a good result by any calculation he had run. Ray said that the numbers were one way of looking at it. He said that his ground commander had a different way of looking at it. Urath asked what that was. Ray said he would show him. The Drath pursuit craft found them 3 hours later. 3 ships broke from a debris field at high speed, moving to intercept the Vale Soren on a direct line. Their approach was straightforward because the Drath tended to move in straight lines toward objectives. They were very good at that. They were not prepared for what happened next. Dana's insertion pods launched from the 7TH's main ships in a pattern that looked chaotic from the outside, but was actually precisely calculated. Each pod was small, cold, and moving in an irregular arc that made it extremely difficult for targeting systems designed to track energy weapons. They moved like thrown rocks, not like ships. 22 minutes later, all 3 Drath pursuit craft had been boarded and taken. The fighting in the corridors had been close and brutal. The Drath were physically larger than humans, and there were more of them per section. Dana's Marines had trained for close-quarters combat in confined spaces under conditions that most species would have considered incompatible with functional performance. The Drath had never imagined that anyone would willingly board a warship and fight through it room by room. Kevin broke the Drath communication encryption on the captured ships and started feeding false position data back to the main collective fleet. It would buy time. Lena was already aboard the lead captured ship, moving through it with a sample kit and a recorder. She found what she was looking for in the ship's biological infrastructure. The Drath were a hive mind species, which meant their ships were partly biological, connected to the wider collective through a nerve cluster network. She identified the primary node location in under an hour. She went directly to Ray with her findings. She explained what she had found, carefully and quickly, standing in the doorway of the command room still wearing her sample collection gloves. Ray listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he called Dana. Urath, watching through the Veil Soren's external cameras, had seen the boarding pods launch. He had watched the Drath ships go quiet. He sat in his command chair for a long time after that, not speaking, trying to reconcile what he had just observed with everything he thought he understood about how conflict worked. His chief communication officer asked him what the humans were. Urath thought about it for a while. He said he was not entirely sure yet, but he thought the word for it had not existed in the Selhari language until now. The plan that Ray and Dana built in the hours after Lena's discovery was not the kind of plan that came out of a tactical manual. It came out of a very specific understanding of what the Seventh Fleet was actually good at, combined with a very specific understanding of what the Drath Collective had probably never seen before. Hive mind species, Dana explained to the briefing room, were built for coordination. Every unit in the collective moved according to shared information, shared response patterns, shared threat models. This made them extremely effective when the situation matched their models. It made them slow to adapt when it did not. The Drath had spent 60 years expanding through this region of space by fighting species that behaved the way species were supposed to behave, which meant defensively, cautiously, trying to protect what they had. The Drath knew exactly how to defeat that kind of opponent. The Seventh was not going to fight like that. Ray divided the fleet into 3 groups. The first, under his direct command, would move to the forward edge of the Drath formation openly. Not to win a straight fight. To hold attention, absorb damage, keep the collective's focus pointed in one direction. Ray's ships would do this by moving in ways that the Drath targeting systems found difficult to resolve, pushing the drives and the maneuvering systems harder than standard operating parameters recommended, because the humans inside those ships were capable of tolerating physical stress that the Drath did not expect living creatures to tolerate. The second group, under Lieutenant Commander Priya Cole, would use the 3 captured Drath ships to move through the collective's rear formation without triggering recognition responses. Priya was from Nevada, small and precise in everything she did, with a habit of solving problems by taking them apart into their smallest components and reassembling them in a better order. She had been briefed on the nerve cluster locations Lena had identified. Her job was to reach the 4 primary nodes at the center of the Drath formation and deliver simultaneous disruption pulses. The third group, under a quiet and steady officer named Art Ben, would stay with the Veil Soren. Art had one order: if everything else failed, run. Get the Selhari out. That was the mission that mattered most. The engagement began at 0340 hours. Ray's group hit the forward Drath line at a speed that made the collective's tactical models flag the approach as sensor error. No crew in their right minds pushed ships at that velocity in a contested zone. The Drath recalculated. By the time they resolved what was actually happening, Ray's ships were already inside the range window where the Drath's larger weapons were inefficient, forcing a shift to close-range systems that the Seventh had specifically trained to counter. The human ships took hits. Real ones. 2 ships lost secondary systems. 1 lost partial hull integrity in a rear section. The crews stayed at their stations. They kept moving, kept firing, kept adapting the approach vector every few minutes in ways that required the Drath targeting systems to restart their calculations. The collective was used to opponents who retreated when they took damage. The Seventh did not retreat. It just got more focused. Priya's group moved through the rear formation without incident for the first 40 minutes. The captured Drath ships responded correctly to every collective identification ping. Kevin's communication work held. They reached the outer edge of the primary node cluster with no alarm raised. The 4 disruption pulses went out simultaneously. The feedback through the collective nerve network was immediate and severe. It was not lethal. The pulses were calibrated to disrupt, not destroy, but the experience of a centralized nerve network receiving a massive disruption signal all at once was something the Drath had no defensive protocol for because it had never happened before. The hive mind equivalent of a concussion rolled through the entire battle group. Ships lost coordinated movement. Communication between units fragmented. For 11 minutes, the Drath formation was in genuine disarray. Dana's Marines used those 11 minutes. They had been positioned in insertion pods behind Priya's group the entire time, waiting. When the disruption hit and the Drath formation lost cohesion, the pods launched toward the flagships at the center of the cluster. The fighting that followed was faster and harder than the first boarding action. The Drath crews in the node ships were larger and more heavily built than the pursuit craft crews. Gus Mercer was pulled out of a corridor section that was actively venting atmosphere with 3 broken ribs and a pressure suit that had failed at the left shoulder seal. He filed his after-action report within the hour anyway, sitting against a bulkhead with his ribs wrapped, writing in his precise and economical style. Kevin, monitoring the collective communication frequency from the main ship, heard something he had not heard before in any alien transmission he had ever analyzed. It took him a moment to find the right word for it. The closest translation he could produce was uncertainty. The Drath were expressing something that functioned like uncertainty, broadcasting it across their network. They were reporting a situation for which they had no existing response category. The Veil Soren crossed into safe transit space at 0614 hours. The Drath pursuit broke off 17 minutes after that. Not all at once. In pieces, ships peeling away from the chase at intervals, as if each unit was arriving independently at the same conclusion. The conclusion, as best Kevin could translate the residual communication traffic, was that the tactical situation had moved outside known parameters and required full collective reassessment before engagement could continue. Ray sat in his command chair and watched the last Drath ship change course on the display screen. He stayed quiet for a long time. Then he asked for a casualty report. 2 ships lost, both crews evacuated before hull failure. 11 wounded across the boarding teams, 3 seriously. No deaths. He read the numbers twice. Then he sent the all-clear to Art Ben's group and authorized medical priority for the Veil Soren's docking approach. Urath met Ray in the observation deck of the flagship 2 days after the battle, when the fleet was in quiet transit and the immediate work of medical treatment, ship repair, and Selhari refugee coordination had settled into a manageable rhythm. The observation deck was a long curved room with a wide viewport that looked out at the stars, and at the moment it held only the 2 of them, plus Kevin standing at a respectful distance to translate the parts of Urath's communication that the Elder's implant did not handle well. Urath was taller than Ray by about half a meter, with a frame that looked like it had been built for a lighter world. He moved carefully in standard gravity, with a particular economy of motion that Lena had told Ray was common in Selhari Elder-class individuals, not frailty but precision. He stood at the viewport for a long time without speaking, and Ray stood beside him and did not push. When Urath finally spoke, he talked about the Selhari concept of expected help, meaning help from sources you had prepared for and planned around. He said that every Selhari colony world had protocols for emergency contact with allied species, with diplomatic partners, with neighbors they had built relationships with over decades. He said that none of those channels had produced a response. By the time the Veil Soren was running dark in the Vreth corridor, he had accepted that expected help was not coming. He said there was a word in Old Selhari, a philosophical term from a period in their history before interstellar contact, for the experience of being rescued by something you had no framework to expect. The word was difficult to translate, Kevin said, but it carried the idea of a gap between what the universe appeared to be and what it turned out to be, a gap that the rescuing thing had walked through by simply not knowing it was not supposed to be able to. Urath said that humans had become that word for his people. Ray was quiet for a moment. He was not good at receiving this kind of weight, the way that soldiers generally were not good at it, because receiving it meant holding still while someone tried to give meaning to things that had mostly felt like problems to solve. He said, finally, that the Selhari could repay the debt by staying connected, by sharing what they knew about the Drath, by not going quiet again when something dangerous started moving in the dark. He said that the galaxy was clearly larger and more complicated than anyone was keeping track of, and it would help everyone if the people who survived bad situations told each other about them. Urath said that this was a very practical response to a philosophical moment. Ray said that practically speaking, the philosophical moment had cost 2 ships and 11 injuries, so he was allowed to be practical about it. Something in Uratha's expression shifted, and Kevin said quietly that he thought that was the Selhari equivalent of finding something genuinely funny. Back on Earth, Admiral Grace read the full after-action reports in her office on a morning when the building was already loud with people trying to understand what had happened in the Vreth corridor and what it meant for Earth's position in this part of space. She read every page. She looked at the casualty numbers for a long time. Then she began drafting a document that was not a battle report or a tactical review. It was a proposal for a framework, a formal structure for communication and mutual aid between humanity and the species that occupied the region around the Vreth corridor. The Selhari would be the first partners. There would be others. The proposal was not a military alliance. It was simpler than that and more fundamental. It was a promise, put into official language, that humanity would answer the call. That the call had a place to go. Dana rotated home on medical leave after the debrief. She drove herself to a diner in rural Montana because she had been thinking about eggs and real coffee for 2 weeks and she was not interested in waiting any longer. She sat at the counter, ordered without looking at the menu, and read the news on her tablet while she waited. There was a small article, not a headline, about a new interstellar framework being proposed following an engagement in the Vreth corridor. The article described it in diplomatic language that made the whole thing sound measured and orderly. Dana read it once, nodded slightly to herself, and went back to watching the cook. Priya Cole filed her technical debrief from aboard ship, 14 pages of precise analysis covering every decision point in the rear formation infiltration. She included 3 pages of suggested improvements for the next time humanity needed to do something like this, because in her assessment there would be a next time, and the second attempt should go better than the first. Kevin was still aboard as well, at his station, working through a growing stack of incoming transmissions. They were not distress calls. They were messages from species that had heard, through the particular informal network of communication that exists between civilizations in proximity, that something had happened in the Vreth corridor. Some of the messages were inquiries. Some were cautious expressions of interest. A few carried a quality that Kevin spent a while trying to name before he settled on something like hopeful apprehension, the feeling of wanting something to be true while not yet being sure it was safe to believe. The galaxy had noticed that the Deathworlders answered. It was still deciding what to make of that. In the Drath Collective, the disrupted network had spent 6 days running a new analytical process, one that had no precedent in their recorded history because it concerned an opponent they had genuinely not been able to categorize. The preliminary conclusion, distributed across every active node, was short: do not engage without complete information. The secondary recommendation took longer to formulate because the collective had to build new language for it. They had never before generated a tactical recommendation that could be accurately translated as a void. Gus Mercer, ribs taped and cleared for light duty, sat in the medical bay with his back against the wall and the worn paperback novel in his hands. He opened it. He read 3 pages. Then he put it back in his breast pocket, stood up carefully, and went to find out what needed doing.